As the Adjustment Bureau draws this analogy between the chairman and God, one of the things that it begins to suggest is that that God is unknowable, and I guess that takes place on a couple of different levels. One way that you see it in the movie, at least, is this idea that that we may have actually met the chairman. We may have met him or her, and there's this sort of sense of vagueness about the properties of the chairman. You have this almost idea that, well, the chairman isn't any particular way, and that's very different than what we find about God in Scripture, who consistently says, I am this and I am not that. I am this way, but I'm not that way. I am these things, but I'm not those things. And so you have a great deal of specificity within Scripture about the nature and character of God. In fact, it's interesting. In spite of the fact that the Old Testament contains a lot of laws that seem very restrictive, and it's difficult to imagine how people could be attracted to a system of laws like that, one of the things that we know for a fact is that especially during, say, late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, we had all kinds of Gentiles, that is, non-Jewish people, that were interested in the Jewish religion and converting to Judaism. And it's a little hard to understand why would you do that when you've got a religion that's so restricted, but I think the answer is because Judaism was specific. It said God is this way and God expects these things, and it was very detailed in a way that no other religion really was. One of the things you get in a lot of the pagan religions around 1st century AD is a tremendous sense of uncertainty. In fact, people would get these little sort of clay discs that they would cast into wells as little like offerings or votive kinds of things, and sometimes we pull them out and they say interesting things like to the unknown God who may or may not have been offended when I did X and such. And you have this very depressing view of religion that emerges. You have people worried that the gods and the goddesses were upset with them or were not upset with them, but could be made happier or could be made unhappy if they did this or didn't do this or did that or didn't do, but we don't really know. And that's one of the frustrating things, is tremendous sense of uncertainty. One of the things that Judaism offered was certainty. God is like this, and God expects these kinds of things. And so there was a great deal of attraction to that. And that's different than the kind of thing that I think that you necessarily get in the Adjustment Bureau. And the other thing the Adjustment Bureau suggests is that God is not knowable, that it's not possible to really have an audience with God or to be in a relationship with God to the extent that you begin to understand who He is. And that one's maybe a little bit more mixed. On the one hand, we can't ever fully know God. Our minds are simply too limited, and right now they're very much clouded by sin and by the confusion that we get from living in a fallen world. But even when that's removed, or as Paul says, when we no longer see through a glass darkly, and we'll see God clearly, but we'll never be able to fully grasp Him because our minds are simply not capable of that level of understanding of who God is, which means that God on some level is unknowable. But the important thing to understand is that just because we can't know God fully doesn't mean that we can't know Him rightly in part. And in fact, a great deal of Scripture seems to be a call to know God to the degree that we're able to. We realize that there's a limit to that. But when we give up too early in our quest to know who God is, then we actually do God a great disservice, and we do ourselves a great disservice, because we were made to know God. Again, not fully, but rightly in part, and there's a huge difference, again, between knowing God fully and knowing God rightly in part. We can't know God completely. We can't fully encompass Him with our theology or our doctrine, but that doesn't mean that our theology or our doctrine is wrong. It simply means it's insufficient to contain the fullness of the majesty of God, but that doesn't mean that it's useless. Truth, even if it's only part truth, is typically far more helpful than complete ignorance.